I think, right? I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. At best, I've dabbled in the latter somewhat. I've been something of a philosopher over the years. For me, studying and then teaching theology also involved exploring a lot of philosophy. Theology asks and tries to answer a lot of the questions that philosophy also asks and tries to answer. It uses a lot of philosophical language. It often draws deeply from certain philosophical wells. For example, Aquinas would not exist without Aristotle. He draws very deeply from that well in order to present his Christian apologia. During the 20th century, different theologians drew heavily on the dominant philosophical schools of the day, existentialism and process philosophy, for instance. So I do know something about philosophy, at least bits and pieces of bits and pieces. And the question of consciousness and the relationship of consciousness to the physical world, and especially in modern times to the brain, has always been a philosophical question as well as a neurological and psychological question. It's a multidisciplinary question. I think. What I seem to be doing, even now as I say this, is thinking. There seems to be a me doing this thinking. See, this is already very philosophical. Cartesian, even. I think, therefore I am. Now, the emphasis in that sentence often falls on am. I think, therefore I am. However, it could just as easily fall on I. I think, therefore I am. I experience myself as an ego operative in the world. So, I guess the starting point for most of us when asking about consciousness is our own experience of being conscious. But there are those who think that what we call consciousness is just the result of physiological and neurological processes going on in the brain. That what we call thinking, as well as other states of consciousness, and it's worth pointing out that thinking is only one form or aspect of consciousness, all of these can be precisely mapped, it's argued, in principle at least, onto the physiological processes of the brain. There, see on this map? That's you thinking, I think. Of course, at the moment our technology is not well enough developed to be able to be that precise. But there are those who believe that, in principle at least, every thought, feeling, dream, psychological state can be traced back to a precise physical substrate within the brain. I've heard this analogy used. Just as the kidneys excrete urine, so the brain excretes consciousness. As it happens, I don't think this is a particularly good analogy. Certainly via certain processes, which I'm sure can, if we look closely enough, be reduced to a series of cause and effect steps, the kidneys produce urine, which is then excreted from the body. We know that. However, we also know that urine is a real thing and that it exists independently of the kidneys once it's been produced. I might disappear after I urinated, but my urine remains there in the urinal. If it were true that the brain excretes consciousness in the same way that the kidneys excrete urine, we would in fact be arguing that consciousness does indeed have an existence independent of the physical substrate, once it has been, well, let's say, generated rather than excreted. But the same people who use this analogy would also argue quite strongly, I think, that this is not the case. Fortunately, I think we can say that our consciousness is not, in fact, like urine. Not all the time, anyway. Although there are those who would argue that consciousness can exist and possibly persist independently of the physical substrate of the body and the brain, I've explored this issue to some extent when I looked at NDEs, at near-death experiences. Nevertheless, I think most would argue that it doesn't. When the brain is disabled, consciousness ceases. Normally we think about death when we think about the brain being disabled or switched off. And there's not a lot that we can say about this, although I do see the NDE stuff that I mentioned a moment ago. But we can also be in a state that we describe, at least, as unconscious. under anesthesia, for example, or when unconscious following an accident of some sort. There's often some continued brain activity even when we're in these states, but there are also what neuroscientists refer to as down states or off periods, when neural firing is largely absent. The brain is very quiescent. We are generally not aware when we are in such states. So it does seem as though awareness can be turned off or at least dialed down. It seems pretty clear that there is, at the very least, an intimate connection between the brain and consciousness. We also know that our state of consciousness can be altered by chemicals, either those our body itself generates or those we introduce into the system from the outside. I've spoken in other videos about two different types of causality, in esse and in fieri causality. Infieri causality is the kind of causality that we see when a cue ball hits the 8-ball. This collision causes the movement of the latter, of the 8-ball. The other kind of causality is when we see the flame of a candle emitting light. The flame sustains that light in being. When the flame is extinguished, the light disappears. I've also argued that it may be that in the real world, if you look closely enough, all causality can actually be reduced to infieri causality, the cue ball, 8-ball type of causality. However, it may be that the relationship between the brain and consciousness is more like that of the flame to the light than of the cue ball to the 8-ball. When the brain ceases to function, consciousness disappears, much like the light from the candle when the flame is snuffed out. I am aware, however, that this is only an analogy and it may be flawed. Most analogies are. An idea that appeals to me is the idea of emergence. What do I mean by that? Well, an emergent property of a system is a property or behavior that a complex system has which its individual components do not have. So, for example, life can be understood as an emergent property of very complex physical and chemical processes. I'm inclined to think that if one were to look very closely at all the quantum and biological processes that were going on in my body at any point in time, or even over a period of time, even if you could map out every single part of that process, we would be unlikely to predict that this would result in what we call life. At a more simple level, if I were to give you this object and ask you to describe it in minute detail, every single component, in principle you may be able to do that. So there you are in there working at this microscopic level, looking at every atom, every molecule. But I think you might nevertheless be surprised when you zoomed out to find that you're actually examining the Mona Lisa. You could do the same with a piece of music, map out all the vibrations in the air, the movement of each and every molecule of air. You would be describing it accurately, but you wouldn't be describing the Brandenburg concertos. The sum is greater than the parts, even though it can't exist without those parts. Maybe consciousness is something like this. We can examine, even down to the quantum level, every single process going on in the brain. But I'm willing to bet that we wouldn't, from this sum of information, be able to predict consciousness. It's an emergent property. It represents a phase shift. In the same way that there's a phase shift when we move from the quantum level to the macro level. Although we know that this macro world that we see around us is entirely dependent on the quantum substrate, it's not entirely predictable from it, and it operates by its own laws. In practice, this is actually how we deal with consciousness. Sure, the neurologist, or even the physicist, may be able to go in and describe this process in very precise detail, all the physiological, electrical, and quantum events. Yet, we still have psychologists who will describe consciousness in terms of an entirely different set of processes, which obey their own rules. That's a phase shift. And this higher level of explaining works at the level for which it is appropriate. It gets kind of difficult, I know, once we start asking these kinds of questions. That's probably because it involves jumping between these different levels, and we try to apply rules that work perfectly at one level to another, where they're simply not appropriate. But I think it's possible to accept these different explanations at different levels simultaneously. We can and do live perfectly well in a kind of multi-level or multiphasic reality. If a particular psychological theory or explanation turns out to be incorrect, we don't look for a new theory or a new explanation at the quantum level. We continue to look at the psychological level.